The young and the restless spoilers. Jill's return to Genoa City carried the kind of weight that only years of history, tangled loyalties, and unresolved wounds could give it. The air around her arrival was thick with the solemnity of Chance's memorial, yet even before she set foot inside the room where family and friends would gather to mourn, whispers had already spread that her homecoming was not simply about grief. There was an unshakable fire in her eyes, a spark that suggested she had more on her mind than just honoring her grandson's memory. The loss of Chance was a wound that cut deeply, but Jill's instincts, honed by decades of surviving betrayals, boardroom wars, and personal heartbreak, told her that this tragedy was tangled with dangerous undercurrents. She had been away too long, and in her absence, the city had shifted. Alliances had formed in the shadows, and among them was one she found particularly disturbing: her own son Billy aligning himself with Cain Ashby, a man whose name was now being whispered alongside Chance's death. It made her stomach churn to think of it. Billy had always been reckless in his need to prove himself, but in recent months, his judgment had taken a darker turn. The Billy she had raised was capable of bad decisions, yes, but this felt like a betrayal not just to family but to something far deeper, a compromise of values that Jill could not excuse. The fact that Cain's presence was now inextricably linked to the murder of Damien Cain only fueled her unease. The city's gossip mills claimed that Carter, Cain's shadowy associate, had killed Damien not out of any personal vendetta, but as a calculated move to clear Cain's path back to Lily Winters. The idea that a life could be ended in such a cold, strategic fashion was sickening, but in Genoa City, it was hardly unprecedented. Still, Jill couldn't wrap her mind around how the man her son now called an ally could be connected to something so vile. And if Billy knew any of this, then his alliance with Cain was not just foolish, it was unconscionable. The day of the memorial unfolded with the strange mix of public sorrow and private tension that always seemed to accompany events in Genoa City. Nina Webster returned, her presence adding an aching authenticity to the grief in the room. She had been close to Chance in ways few truly understood, and seeing her again only deepened Jill's own sorrow. Yet even as they embraced, Jill's mind was elsewhere, sifting through the fragments of rumor and half-truth that had reached her ears. She knew this city too well to believe in coincidences, especially now. Someone had wanted Damien out of the way, and if the whispers were true, Carter had been the one to ensure that happened. But Carter was not the type to act without direction. If he had pulled the trigger, it was because someone had given the order, or at least stood to benefit. And in this case, the one who benefited most appeared to be Cain. The reasoning was as brutal as it was simple. Damien's presence in Lily's life had been an obstacle Cain could not overcome through charm or persuasion, so instead it was removed entirely. It was the kind of ruthless maneuver Jill had seen in corporate warfare, except here the battlefield wasn't a boardroom, it was a human life. In the days leading up to her arrival, Jill had quietly asked a few questions of her own, and the picture that emerged was unsettling. Carter's loyalty to Cain was absolute, perhaps even obsessive, and his methods were those of a man who had long ago abandoned any moral compass. The true horror came when she learned of the confrontation between Cain and Carter, a confrontation that ended not in a severing of ties but in an escalation that put Lily directly in the crosshairs. According to the accounts she had pieced together, Cain had confronted Carter about Damien's death, perhaps expecting some kind of explanation or denial. Instead, Carter had turned the situation into a terrifying standoff, grabbing Lily and pressing the cold muzzle of a gun against her shoulder. It was a moment designed to send a message, not just to Cain but to anyone who might stand in Carter's way. The symbolism was unmistakable. Lily was both leverage and a warning, a living reminder that in this game, emotions were liabilities to be exploited, not cherished. Jill could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had known Cain for years, seen him at his most charming and at his most desperate, but this went beyond desperation. This was the kind of toxic entanglement that could only end in ruin. Yet here was Billy, aligning himself with that very man, as though oblivious, or worse, indifferent, to the danger it posed to everyone connected to them. In Jill's mind, the web of deceit stretched far beyond Carter's trigger finger. It touched Kane's ambition, Billy's questionable loyalty, and Lily's precarious position in the middle of it all. And somewhere in that web was the lingering question of Chance's death. Was it truly an unrelated tragedy, or just another calculated move in a series of power plays? The more Jill thought about it, the more she feared that nothing about the timing was accidental. Her return to Genoa City would not be a quiet one. Jill knew that mourning Chance was important, but so was protecting what remained of her family. If Billy was too blind, or too stubborn, to see the trap he was walking into, then she would have to open his eyes, even if it meant shattering whatever fragile trust remained between them. She would demand answers from him, from Kane, and if necessary, from Carter himself. And she would do it in the only way she knew how, directly, relentlessly, and without fear of making enemies. After all, in a city where alliances shifted like sand and even family could become a threat, Jill understood that survival depended on knowing who was truly on your side and who was merely waiting for the right moment to turn against you. But what she didn't yet know was that her arrival would set off a chain reaction. Carter's grip on Lily, both figuratively and literally, was not a one-time act of intimidation. It was part of a broader strategy to ensure Kane's dominance in the personal and political games being played behind Genoa City's polished facades. And Jill's presence, with her sharp instincts and unwillingness to back down, was already being seen as a threat by those who had the most to lose. In the quiet corners of the city, plans were being adjusted, conversations were being held in hushed tones, and more than one person was asking the same question. If Jill started pulling on the wrong thread, how long would it take before the entire tapestry of deceit unraveled, and how many people would be destroyed when it did? This was no longer just about Chance's death or even Damien's murder. It was about control, power, and the lengths people were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. And Jill, whether she realized it yet or not, had just stepped into the very center of the storm. Jill's return to Genoa City had already been a storm in the making, but the revelations that followed turned it into a tempest no one could escape. The news from France had traveled like a dark wind, carrying with it the details of a confrontation so brutal and unexpected that even the most hardened citizens of this city were shaken. Carter, the man whose presence had long been a shadow over Kane's life, had cornered Chance in a final act of violence, leveling a gun at him in a tense and irreversible moment. And then, in a move no one could have predicted, Carter had turned the weapon on himself. By the time the echoes of the gunshots had faded, both men were gone, their bodies lying alongside that of Damien, whose murder had already ignited a chain of events too tangled to fully comprehend. 3 lives extinguished in France, leaving behind a trail of grief, rage, and unanswered questions that stretched across continents to land squarely in the heart of Genoa City. When Jill and Nina first learned of the precise circumstances surrounding Chance's death, there was no way to soften the blow. This was not the clean narrative of a heroic sacrifice or an unavoidable tragedy, it was an ugly, chaotic mess born of ambition, manipulation, and the collision of too many dangerous agendas. Jill's grief was quickly poisoned by clarity. She and Nina, though shattered, were united in their conviction that Kane bore responsibility for what had happened, whether or not his hands had physically pulled the trigger. To them, Carter had been an extension of Kane's will, a blunt instrument wielded for personal gain, and the carnage in France was the ultimate consequence of letting such men operate unchecked. In the days that followed, Jill's sorrow hardened into something far sharper when she began to see the shape of her son's latest schemes. Billy's behavior since Chance's death was not that of a man honoring the memory of family, it was that of a man maneuvering for position, circling opportunities like a shark scenting blood in the water. Word reached Jill that Billy was actively encouraging Kane to buy Abbott Communications, the company Jill had once considered part of her family's legacy. Worse still, he was pushing for Kane's support in acquiring Chancellor Industries, the very empire that Chance's memory should have safeguarded. It was as though the tragedy had opened a door, and Billy was all too willing to walk through it if it meant rescuing his own failing ventures. The sheer audacity of it made Jill's hands tremble with a mix of fury and disbelief. To exploit the violent death of her grandson for corporate advantage was more than insensitive, it was a moral betrayal. She could not reconcile the image of the boy she had raised with the man standing before her now, the man willing to clasp hands with Cain Ashby, whose history with deception and manipulation was as long as it was damning. Jill knew Billy's justification before he even spoke it. He had already spun the line to Lily, telling her that working with Cain was his way of honoring Chance, that building something strong in his name was a tribute. But to Jill, that was just another layer of self-deception, a comforting fiction Billy clung to so he wouldn't have to face the uglier truth, that he was aligning himself with a man complicit in the destruction of their family, and doing so for nothing more than the promise of a better position in a high-stakes corporate game. When Jill finally confronted him, the air between them was electric with tension. She had weathered many storms with Billy over the years, but this felt different. This wasn't about reckless gambling, ill-advised romances, or impulsive betrayals. This was about his willingness to sell a piece of his soul to someone she considered irredeemable. She told him as much, her voice cutting through the comfortable haze of denial he had wrapped himself in. He was too blinded by his own ambition, she warned, too fixated on clawing his way back into relevance to see the truth about Cain. Every instinct Jill had screamed that Cain was a conman, a man who thrived on exploiting chaos and bending others to his will, and it was revolting to watch her own son fall into his orbit. In her mind, Billy's alliance with Cain was more than a lapse in judgment, it was a stain on the memory of Chance, a desecration of what he had stood for. Jill could see the larger pattern now. Cain, always adept at presenting himself as the solution while being the source of the problem, had maneuvered himself into a position where he could not only reshape his public image but also extend his influence into companies that once stood as symbols of Abbott pride and Chancellor legacy. And Billy, perhaps unwittingly, was helping him do it. It was a dangerous bargain, one that would cost them far more than they stood to gain. The confrontation left no one unscathed. Billy, stung by his mother's accusations, tried to hold his ground, insisting that Jill was letting grief cloud her judgment. But Jill knew better. Grief did not cloud, it clarified. It stripped away the polite lies and the excuses, leaving only the raw truth. And the truth was that Cain's hands were dirty, his motives were self-serving, and anyone who stood too close to him would inevitably be tainted. Jill would not stand by and watch Billy use the death of her grandson as currency in a business deal, nor would she allow Cain to tighten his grip on the companies that bore their family names. What neither of them realized was that forces outside their personal feud were already moving. The deaths in France had not just left a vacuum in personal relationships, they had disrupted a delicate balance of power. There were others who stood to gain from the chaos, others who saw in the triple tragedy an opportunity to reshape Genoa City's corporate and political landscape. In that shifting terrain, Jill's determination to protect her family and Billy's hunger for control were on a collision course, with Cain at the volatile center. In Genoa City, grief had a way of breeding ambition, and ambition had a way of erasing the line between loyalty and betrayal. Jill knew this better than most, and as she stood in the aftermath of Chance's death, she vowed not to let that line vanish completely, not for her family, not for Chancellor Industries, and certainly not for the memory of the grandson whose life had been cut short by the very darkness now threatening to consume them all.